No, I don't. Okay, let's begin with the Our Father, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Now I started with the Our Father because there is that phrase in there, hallowed be thy name. In other words, sacred. In the book of Job that we're going to be studying, the tetragram itself is going to be mentioned by Job like 3 times, I think. And a lot of authors say that, well, that indicates that he's a very holy man. Although most Jews, that name, the tetragram itself, is only going to be said once a year in the temple by the high priest. Other than that, you're supposed to say Adonai, or the Lord. So the story of Job, a lot of it has to do with many different topics, and I'm going to be reading actually from the Navari Bible on the kind of an introduction, and then we'll get to Ignatius here on reading it. In classical studies, we always start out with know thyself. That gets translated, obviously, into Christian parlance as you're at each night when you go through your examine of yourself, leading up to maybe, and usually hopefully, your confession. And this is the best really way of knowing thyself, to go over what you've maybe done wrong and what you've done right each day, and try to do something better the next day to overcome things. And that's also with confession too. Sometimes there's things that you've done that need to be confessed to have God give you forgiveness. And so we're going to get into that with Job, where he has one idea of himself. Now, he's going to be tested. Now, anybody here know another great test in the Bible where somebody is being tested? Yes, Karen, you're right. Abraham, remember when he was to undergo the test, and he was up there along with Isaac, who's also being tested. And then all of a sudden, an angel just says, all right, stop this. Don't kill the boy. You have proven that you love God, no doubt about it, and put him first of all. And I even think with Isaac, who has not much to say here, but I believe that he had such faith in God too, that even if he were killed, somehow he would be brought back to life. And a lot of scholars have kind of made a connection between that sacrifice of Isaac and Jesus being sacrificed on the cross. So there's a lot of knowing that, in that case, Job is going to be tested too on his faithfulness to God. But also Job is going to kind of receive a lot of training here by God himself on humility. And that's a great lesson for most of us. I can remember many years ago when I had students. Invariably, you'd have a parent coming in, and with the usual line that, oh, my son and I are very, very good people. And I don't like the idea of you pointing to me saying that my son has too much esteem and not enough humility. Well, that's a pride right there. Back about 40, 50 years ago, you had this self-esteem movement, and it was a dead end. Simply because other people know that, no, you're not that good of a person. A lot of people have a false image of themselves, and this is why, like I say, you need to go through that examine each night or whenever you can and try to improve upon your faults and confess your sins. And don't think that you're the cat's pajamas or the great person that you think you are. You'll find that a lot of people have a different point of view of who you are than you do. And so there's going to be that in Job. A lot of people are going to wonder about his afflictions and all that, and they're going to give their opinions. Now, also in this, okay, we have Job. I think they put the tetragram in there to try to show that he is a very faithful Jew. And also that you have three other accusers besides Satan, three other friends of his. And to my way of reading things, those are not Jewish names. So we kind of have also a competition here between faiths in more than one way. And I'm now going to read from the Navarre introduction on Job here. There is more than one message in the book of Job. In general terms, we can say that it deals with questions about the wisdom and justice of God, about man's attitude to suffering, and about man's relationship with God. Number one, the themes to do with God are very much to the fore. St. Thomas Aquinas saw the book as a detailed and profound explanation of divine providence. Modern commentaries see it as an attempt to marry divine wisdom as evidence in nature with the justice that God dispenses to men, or, more specifically, as an attempt to make sense of the suffering of the innocent. That is, to understand how God's justice can permit and often directly cause an innocent person to experience suffering and misfortune. The book provides three answers to this paradox. Number one, in the prologue, the author uses the ancient Job story to show that God puts the upright to the test, much like what God put Abraham up to the test. They need to prove that they fear God for naught. That is, not for any personal advantage they might gain as a reward for good behavior. And they must show that if adversity strikes, they will not turn around and curse God. For if the Lord consents to test Job with suffering, he does it to demonstrate the latter's righteousness. The suffering has the nature of a test. Job passed the test. He stayed true to God. He blessed God despite his plight, and no complaint passed his lips. 2, the dialogue between Job and his friends. The solution to the problem of suffering is less clear. On one hand, God does not punish the wicked and reward the good in an automatic way. The fact that someone experiences misfortune does not mean that he is guilty of sin, nor does prosperity prove that a person is good. Now, that was kind of a belief of a lot of the ancient Jews, that If you're good, you get rewarded. If even with a physical infirmity or something like that, somebody has done something bad, either you or your parents. Of course, Jesus says, no, that's not the way of it when he cured people. While it is true that suffering has a meaning as punishment when it is connected with a fault, it is not true that all suffering is a consequence of a fault and has the nature of punishment. However, the three friends fail to solve the problem, and Job's replies to their speeches are really an appeal for God himself to provide the answer. And God will come down and answer this. Three, finally, the speeches of the Lord point the way to a definitive answer. They allow us to see that every part of creation has a role to play. Even the elements that determine the weather, even the fact that rain falls in inhabitable places, or that the ostrich fails to sit on her nest. The speeches do not give an in-depth explanation of suffering, but they set it in a wider context of creation as a whole. This explanation, typical of wisdom writing, will probably not satisfy the individual sufferer, but it does imply a considerable advance on earlier thinking by showing that suffering has a place in the mysterious purposes of God. And I'm just going to add right here, and it will be brought up a little bit later. Christ suffered, and why he suffered? Because of love. And so in the Christian context, there's a direct, it doesn't seem to be all that obvious to a lot of people, but there's a connection between love and suffering. If you love a child, you will suffer with that child if something goes wrong, and a lot of other ways too, that in love or in suffering there is love. When somebody is very sick or dying, that's when we remember the love that we have for that person. Okay, now continuing here. From the anthropological point of view, the book also has things to say about the attitude man should adopt with regard to his own suffering. He needs to see himself in the context of all creation and the greatness of God. The book of Job is not just about moral integrity, loyalty, and faith, about the ongoing tension between a just man's sense of loyalty and the difficulties God himself sends him. It really has a much greater, deeper message, namely that no created being and certainly no human being is alien to God. God provides man with wealth or poverty, health or misfortune, the company of friends or isolation. Whatever the circumstances the individual person may find her or himself in, God never neglects that person. The book does not go much further than this, but it does give the impression that man is a privileged creature, one who can appreciate the attributes and the reasons for being of all created beings and things, and one who can see that everything that happens to him personally is part of a divine plan. So God has got a plan for all of us. And never forget that. Okay, 3 here. The clearest teaching in the book has to do with man's relationship with God. Right through the debate with his friends, Job repeatedly calls on God to act as the judge of his own situation. The dramatic tension built up over the course of the debate eventually leads to the theophany in which the Lord addresses Job out of the whirlwind. After all his speeches, Job now realizes that they didn't amount to much, and he decides to hold his tongue, not so much on account of what God tells him, but rather because God has deigned to listen to him. So a person is able to share ideas with his equals, but he can also communicate with God. He will not thereby be able to resolve all of his doubts or solve all of his problems, but he will get a good reception from the one who knows all things and can do all things. Clearly, in the book of Job, the Old Testament does not lift the veil that shrouds the mystery of suffering, but it is only in the New Testament, in light of Christ's suffering on behalf of others, that we are able to see that divine justice is not undermined by phenomenon of human suffering. In fact, suffering is something fruitful. It is a sign indeed of divine justice. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Hence, the book of Job has come to be seen as heralding the passion of Christ. It raises the subject of suffering in a moral context. How good can it be good? And says that the argument that suffering is punishment for sin is an inadequate one. Christ's passion enables us to see the meaning of suffering in the terms of the love of God. Quote, who so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. That's from John 3:16. Quote, but in order to perceive the true answer of the why of suffering, we must look to the revelation of divine love, the ultimate source of meaning of everything that exists. Christ causes us to enter into the mystery and to discover the why of suffering as far as we are capable of, grasping the sublimity of divine love. In order to discover the profound meaning of suffering, following the revealed Word of God, we must open ourselves wide to the human subject in his manifold potentiality. We must above all accept the light of revelation, not only insofar as it illuminates this order of love as the definitive source of everything that exists. Love is also the fullest source of the answer to the question of the meaning of suffering. This answer has been given by God to man in the cross of Jesus Christ. Now, also in the New Testament, when we talk about love, we're talking about agape love. In other words, that selfless love, love for others. Unfortunately, in English, love has too many definitions, and a lot of them are not nice. But that's really what it's all going to be about, is God's, that he teaches us the connection between love and suffering. And in life, you're going to do a lot of suffering. I think some of the ones that I've personally known that probably suffered for something that she had done. She had an abortion. And it was very, very difficult for her ever to get over that when she realized that, no, that was the wrong thing to do. And there are many organizations like Operation Rachel, I believe is the name of it, to help women out. That, and then, of course, the next step to get that a lot of testing done and help, Christian help too. So it's one of the big problems. And husbands also suffer from that too, of losing a child. It doesn't happen that as much as with the women, but it does happen. It haunts them for the rest of their lives. The son or the daughter that they never will have. Okay, continuing here. Even so, no particular attention is given in the New Testament to the book of Job or to Job himself. As indicated at the start of this introduction, the only reference is in the letter of St. James when he praises Job in James 5:11. Reference is in the letter, pardon me. However, Christian tradition has interpreted Job as making reference to the afterlife and announcing the resurrection of the dead. In the Latin Vulgate, for example, interprets this famous passage of 19:25 in the Messianic message, Scio quod redemptor meos vivit in novissimo Dei resurrexum sum. Translated, I know that my Redeemer lives and that on the last day I will rise from the earth. The liturgy of the dead changed the opening word. The opening word to credo, the I believe. I know after Vatican II they had credamus, like we believe, but no, it means when you go through that, it's the I believe. Thereby making the verse an act of faith in the resurrection of Christ and of all the dead. Okay, so that's the end of that. Now, let us open up our book of Job here, and we're going to start at the beginning. I think we can get through quite a bit here. The chapters are short. Now, there's going to be a person in here called Satan. In English, they call him Satan. But it's not really the devil. It's more like the devil's advocate. In other words, Satan itself means accuser. For example, whenever somebody, let's say like Fulton Sheen goes before sainthood, they have obviously a lot of material to collect and all that to make sure that he lived a holy life and all that. But there is one person, the devil's advocate, that will try to dig up all the dirt because, and is it true or not? So they're not only going to look at the good things for a candidate, but the bad things as well, just to get a balance in whether or not this really person deserves to be sainted or not. Okay, that's all right. So now, even where I work, for example, periodically you have to go through these what-if statements on the facility itself. What if we get hit with a 8.0 earthquake? What's going to stand? What's going to fall? What do you need to do? And we have to do that periodically, and especially when we get new equipment, or if there's a building that's taken down and a new one put up and all that. So, and in those what ifs, they can, like the worst one would be an earthquake. So that's kind of like a devil's advocate there. But you got to have an answer for that because it could happen. Okay, so now let's read here Job and his family. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels, 5,000 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all people of the East. Now, I don't know in here if, the footnote here, 1:1, land of Uz, somewhere in northern Arabia, either northeast of Canaan near Aram, or southeast of Canaan near Edom. But anyway, it's to the east of the Holy Land. Okay. Let's go down to the footnote there where it has kind of that little eagle type thing. 1, 2, 3 here. Job is introduced as a prosperous chieftain and herdsman, possibly involved in caravan trading. His 10 children and thousands of animals are signs of God's blessings on his life. And that's going to be one of these arguments, too, that, well, if these are all blessings of God, when they are taken away, well, God has the right to do that, too, right? So that's going to be one of these arguments in here, that what the God gives, God can also take away. And that teaching also was, I can remember as a young child, it's that, listen, not everything is your creation or doesn't come out of your genius. And I know when I went through college, there were times when I knew God was helping me get through school. There's no doubt about it. Okay, so his sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, quote, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. So he's also praying and for his children especially. Something that we all need to do, especially young parents. Okay, Satan is allowed to tempt God, or Satan, and I'm going to probably pronounce it Satan because most people around the world, including Canadians. In fact, there's a well-known Canadian hockey player by the name of Satan. And that's how he pronounces his name. And he's French Canadian. And in France, it's Satan, and Spanish, so forth. A lot of other languages. We don't use the Satan. That's an English idiom. So I'm going to go with Satan. Yes, go ahead.
For this French man.
I don't know that much about him, other than his jersey sells like crazy, unfortunately. And which I don't know whether or not to go into that or not. But here, let's continue. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going back and forth on earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered to the Lord. Just a minute. I think I might have skipped a page here. Oh, no. Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? Have you blessed the works of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land? But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only upon himself do not put forth your hand. So Satan went forth and from the presence of the Lord. So now we're going to get into this trial where the accuser now is going to basically take away all the good. Verse 13. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell upon them and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, quote, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. That was probably a thunderbolt or something like that came from the sky. Now, we're stepping down to word study here. Now, this is Scott Hahn's interpretation, Satan. And you notice there's little markings over the A's. In most languages, a certain letter, like an A, is going to be pronounced the same all the time, like an ah sound, Satan. You don't mess things up like in English. Okay, a legal term meaning adversary or accuser. It can refer to a prosecutor in court, such as in Psalms here, or more broadly, to a hostile political opponent in 1 Kings, or even an enemy combatant on the field. In one case, the angel of the Lord acts as an adversary to obstruct the way of Balaam. A few occurrences of this term refer to a spiritual being that the Bible elsewhere calls the devil. He is the dark spirit who sows evil in the hearts of men and accuses them before the Lord. Use of this term presents an early stage on this way to the developed understanding. Scholars infer this because the Hebrew text of Job never speaks of Satan as a proper name, but only refers to the Satan or the adversary as a functional description. Still, the basic contours of the idea are already visible. Clearly, this figure is no benevolent spirit who patrols the earth and faithful servants to the Lord. On the contrary, challenges God's knowledge of Satan, of Job's motives, and puts Job in a situation that he proudly asserts will turn against him, against God. Now, eventually, of course, Satan is going to lose in this. People like that never really do win. Thank God. Now, okay, so has lost his children. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 companies and made a raid upon the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Now, a lot of times you'll notice that the phrases are pretty much the same here at the end on slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have come to tell you. And then later on, we're going to get into a lot of verses, poetry in Job. And that's because the repetition of phrases and poetry are very easy to memorize and then repeat to others. For example, the great Greek stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and of course the great Roman Virgil's Aeneid, these things are all in poetic form, and they actually have a beat to them. And it's very easy for people, and there's also a lot of repetition too in there. And so it's very easy for people like Homer to tell these stories to a lot of other people, because he can keep it in his mind. He doesn't have to have scrolls. He's not reading anything, because he knows the story, and he knows the beat of the meter and so forth, and the repetitions and so forth. So that tells you that this is a relatively older, at least some people say 7 BC to 4 BC script here that we're reading. Okay, so while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the elders' house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job arose and tore his robe. Now that's the sign of distress, and you're going to have that in the Old and the New Testament, of people tearing their garments. And shaved his head and fell upon the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. See, that's the old saying there. Lord gives, and Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Always remember that fear of the Lord. The Lord is a lot stronger, has control. He created the universe. He created all of us. And that's why he's saying, blessed is the name of the Lord, because he knows that the Lord needs to be revered and worshiped. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Chapter 2. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and they should have an article there, and the Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to the Satan, from where have you come? Satan answered the Lord, from going back and forth on the earth, and from walking up and down on it. See, again, that's the same phrase that he's used earlier. So and the reason for that is so that people can remember. All right, now, excuse me. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? Again, a repetition here. He still holds fast his integrity, although you moved me against him to destroy him without cause. Then Satan answered the Lord, skin for skin, all that man has he will give for his life. But put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to the Satan, behold, he is in your power, only spare his life. And so Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with loathsome sores, and the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd with him to scrape himself, and sat among the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." I don't know if my wife would say that to me. I hope not. So he's lost everything, and he's even losing his wife here. I mean, she's not going to die, but the marriage is at the end here. But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women who would speak. Shall we receive good at the hands of God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came upon each from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to console him and comfort him. Okay, now going back to those names of those people and the places or tribes that they're from are, to me, they're not Jewish, so there's something else. Let's see, do we have... well, here's a note here. Okay, on 2:11-13, footnote. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar respond to the news of Job's plight. They probably came from the region of Edom, south of the Dead Sea. The names Eliphaz and Teman are Edomite connections in Genesis 36. And biblically, Edom was renowned for its wise men. All 3 visitors contribute to the dialogues of the chapters. So he's not exactly saying, other than where they came from, but the genesis of the tribes are obviously different from Israel. Okay. And then, so we got these 3 people coming. And they saw him from afar, and they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes, again in sign of distress, and sprinkled dust upon their heads. And that, again, you'll see that in many times. Toward heaven, and they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Okay, now let's see. Do I have time to do chapter 3 or not? Yeah, I think we can. Do we have another group coming in after this? No? Okay. Okay, we'll do 3 as well here. Now, this is in poetic form. And in the original Hebrew, these things, I don't know, there's a way of Greek poetry, Greek poetry as well as Hebrew poetry that's different than ours. But again, a lot of poetry. You were probably all brought up on Robert Frost or something like that you could probably still remember. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, "Let the day perish where I was born, and the night which said, a man's child is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the years. Let it not come into the number of the months. Yes, let that night be barren, let no joyful cry be heard in it. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are skilled to rouse up Leviathan. Now, he's going to talk about two creatures here. Down in the bottom here, 3:8. Those who curse, professional soothsayers who would be hired to invoke a curse or spell on persons, places, or particular days. Now, Leviathan, the name of a mythical sea dragon who personified the forces of chaos and who was thought to swallow the sun during a solar eclipse. And anyway, it also goes into Babylon mythology. Of course, it's going to come also into the book of Revelations, too, along with, I think it's, what is it, Behemoth and Leviathan. Anyway, we will continue here. Let the stars of its dark dawn be dark, and let it hope for light, but have none, nor the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me? Or why the breasts that I should suck? For then I should have lain down and been quiet. I should have slept, then I should have been at rest with the kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not hidden untimely birth, as an untimely birth, as infants that never see the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They hear not the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are here, and the slave is free from his master. Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden from God, has hedged in? For my sighing comes as my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. And then we have the next chapter about Eliphaz coming in. So he is not only worried about just dying, but his reputation, his integrity. He's a man that's obviously well known. 3 people show up. And he had all these vast amounts of camels and oxen and so forth, and probably thought that he was well thought of by many people. I mean, he's going to be losing all that, so he's worried about not only dying, but his reputation from then on. I mean, other people down the generations are going to say that, hey, there was something really wrong with him. So on that note, are there any questions about, I think that's one of the things that when people are dying is, that's why they like to have people around them when you're passing on. all your friends and people that loved you, and you hope that your reputation, your integrity will be forwarded on down the line. There's usually the case in a lot of great literature where somebody dies alone, forgotten. One of the worst punishments. Yeah, Ahab was Jezebel's husband. He was a king, and he was evil. He a lot of images and gods from other religions were brought in. That was the main really sin of Ahab and Jezebel, was all these other foreign gods and images and so forth that they spread throughout Israel. And yeah, the main character there is Ishmael, who is the son from Abraham by way of Hagar, the slave. So there's a lot of, and there's also an interpretation of I can't think of the name. About being swallowed by the whale and all that type of stuff. Jonah, yeah. At the beginning, there's going to be an exegesis by some minister that's going to talk about that. And yeah, the problem is the way Jonah. The English translation is dove, and dove, D-O-V-E, and that's just why when we talk about the sign of Jonah, you're actually talking about the Holy Spirit. So there's a lot in Herman Melville's writing. He was a civil servant, worked on the docks in New York, and he wrote on the side. One of those things that not a professional writer, but he wrote some interesting works. Yeah. Okay, so are we ready for the? Yes, go ahead.
Another reason why you might want to have your love. I don't like to think about this.
Right.
In case you started having.
Right. Right. Yes. Well, anyway. Okay, are we ready? Somebody push. Well, it's over there. The land of Uz, yeah, U-Z is.
Oh, okay.
Um, it's over there by Edom, which is east.
King Joe.
Ur. Uh,
Thank you.
well, we'll go over the questions the next time.
Thank you.
You bet.
I'm Father Joseph Koterski from the Department of Philosophy at Fordham University in the Bronx. Most of my work is on the great philosophers of history, but I also have a great love of the Bible. Perhaps you do too. Some parts of the Bible are probably better known than others. I think, for instance, of the wonderful stories of the book of Genesis, the stories about Jesus and the Gospels, the stories of the liberation of the chosen people from their captivity in Egypt. This course will examine some of the lesser-known books of the Bible, and particularly the books of biblical wisdom literature, such as the haunting story of Job, a man afflicted even though innocent, the constant exhortations to fidelity that occur in the book of Proverbs or the book of Sirach. I think that this set of books of the Bible is of great significance for those who are believers, as well as for those who may not believe, but perhaps are still searching, precisely because of its concentration on some of the great problems, such as human suffering, or the education of our young people, the ways in which we seek to grow in virtue and to avoid vice, the ways in which we try to make decisions and learn how to make better and more prudential decisions, both about the specific questions of life as well as about questions of vocation and career, or the kind of trust that we need to exhibit when we're making new friends or choosing marriage partners. Our questions for this course will be about those topics. And in particular, right here at the start, I'd like to concentrate a little bit, as an example, about what the Bible has to say about the problem of suffering. For we all know the fact that there is suffering in the world, and sometimes simply awful things happen to good people. That problem of suffering is something that we can approach from many perspectives, from philosophy, but also from the Bible. And what I'd like to concentrate on in this course is what the Bible has to teach us in this regard. When we think about suffering, we might be doing it from our own acquaintance. Perhaps we've had strong cases of personal suffering in our own lives. Perhaps we've simply known very close at hand family members or friends who've had significant suffering. Or maybe we're simply thinking about people far off, people we've seen on television, things we've only read about, and the sufferings they have that they just don't seem to deserve. When the suffering really hits home, whether by virtue of what we've read or perhaps by virtue of what we ourselves have found. I find that some people have the experience of really having their faith tested, sometimes losing their faith. God can seem so unjust that they just cannot allow themselves to believe in that sort of God anymore. Or other people tend to blame themselves. That is, they get a sense, and rightly so, that there's a connection between sin and guilt and its consequences. And there can arise in a person a torturous sense that they must somehow be responsible if someone they know is suffering, perhaps their children, and they make this connection. So what I'd like to ask in this course, right here at the start, by way of an example of our approach to biblical wisdom literature, is what the Bible has to say about it and what we might take away from it, whether we ourselves are believers, perhaps Jewish or Christian or Muslim. We do so because we have a deep respect for the Bible, precisely as God's Word, something that was indeed revealed to us, and it has an effect for those at the time that it was revealed, but then also has a deep effect and a significance for us today. But I think that this material will also be of great hope even for folks who are non-believers, for people who are perhaps searching or simply interested, who are alert to the way in which the Bible has shaped human culture, shaped the culture especially of the West, and that knowing more about the Bible will help us even understand our current culture and those whose minds and whose hearts are shaped by this biblical understanding. I think that the Bible has an awful lot to teach us then about many questions, including the question of human suffering. Why, for example, God seems to allow deep suffering. Why it is inappropriate to start blaming oneself simply because one is suffering or somebody whom you know is suffering. That there's more in that question that we need to examine. And so our reflection upon these biblical themes will give us the opportunity to do that. We'll also look at many other questions that the biblical wisdom literature offers. My own interest in coming to this is multifaceted. As a teacher of philosophy there at Fordham, I'm fascinated with biblical wisdom literature because it is the most philosophical. It's that part of the Bible, books like Job or Koheleth, which are filled with questions about the meaning of human existence, about some of life's most important questions, not only the endurance of suffering, the question of the suffering of the innocent, but how to show our compassion toward others who are suffering, how to educate our children, and all those other big problems of the wisdom literature. Now, we philosophers tend to be a little bit skeptical. We want to know why things are the way they are. We want to know how it is that people claim to know what they claim to know, and whether their arguments, whether their evidence is sufficient. I'm absolutely amazed the way in which the Bible's wisdom books show some of that same questioning attitude. I also bring the perspective of belief from a particular faith tradition. I'm a Catholic Christian, in fact, a Jesuit priest, and I think that there is something from this tradition that I can bring to bear that will be of great interest both to those who share my convictions and belong to the same household of the faith, and to those who are not, but who are interested and perhaps searching. Let me raise the question quite directly. You may be saying at this point, should I continue with this lecture, this series, given the perspective of the lecturer? And I would certainly hope so, especially because of the intrinsic importance of the Bible, of this common biblical material which Jews and Christians and other people of the book share. It's also something that this particular tradition has that I think is of genuine and common human wisdom. And so I'd like to share some of those perspectives. And I can only think about how much in my own life and in my own course of studies I have learned regularly by reading and studying the perspectives that come from traditions that are not my own, either not my own religiously or not my own convictions philosophically. And so I would hope that this sort of discussion from this perspective will be interesting to you and helpful. I've tried to provide some discussion questions at the end of each of our lectures, and my hope is that that will also provide something for the lively sharing of different perspectives. I hope that you will share my interest in this sapiential literature as part of our common human heritage, the way in which human culture has emerged, especially in the West. It's something that remains important, deeply important for the Jewish community as well as for the Christian community. Let me say a few things here at the beginning also just about this Christian perspective on things. Christians take the very center of the Bible to be the person of Christ. In regard to the question of suffering that I'd like to begin with in this lecture series, Jesus presents himself as an innocent man who is he's a paradigm case of innocent suffering. And whether one shares that particular matter of belief about his divinity, it's very useful to know how Christians come at this material. According to the Christian faith, Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God, who then took on human nature and became man for our salvation. We call that the incarnation. Even if one does not share that particular belief, there's still a lot to learn from him. He is a case in a way that's like the case of Job from earlier in the Scriptures, one who is entirely just and innocent, and yet, in his case, one who consciously accepts the suffering. In fact, he goes to his death precisely, he says, for the rest of us. In what the New Testament records of his deeds and of his words, he explained his own embrace of suffering in some of the very same categories that the Bible in its earlier portions used for the problem of the innocent suffering. One thinks of the ways, for example, in which he quotes Isaiah or alludes to Job. He envisioned himself as making a sacrificial offering of himself, and then of completing what earlier figures in biblical history had begun. There's a way in which he is the new Adam, recapitulating the earlier Adam. There's a way in which he's like Abraham and Isaac and Moses, and is trying to complete what they had begun. Toward the end of our course, we'll leave some time specifically for that consideration of Jesus and his own deeds and words, but there's a way in which reflection on that can also add something to the dimension of what we want to study in looking at some of these earlier books. Let me turn then to the specific question about suffering in the Bible. It's a theme that is recounted in any number of the parts of the Bible. For instance, in the early portion, which is called Torah, the law, it's also described in very interesting ways and reflected upon in the writings of the prophets. But it's of a special interest in the books that are the sapiential part of the Bible, the biblical wisdom books. What we'll be doing in our course is going through those books and perhaps comparing one with another on a given topic, like the topic of suffering. One sees it in a book like Job precisely because we have an innocent man here who is without blame. If he's not entirely sinless, he's at least not guilty of the sort of sin that provoked the amount of suffering that he has. But we'll take that perspective and compare it with the perspective that we find in other books, such as the book of Proverbs. There's a way in which, and perhaps I'm showing my cards here as a philosopher, there's a way in which this is a bit of a debate, and a debate in which the Bible itself is entering, but also, I would hope, in which you're entering. And I suggest that precisely because in this discussion on problems like suffering, there's insight to be gained by the way in which the biblical figures themselves discuss it and the way in which we react to that. So one finds here in this something of the philosophical character. There's something about the different points of view that humans are capable of that's extremely interesting. And then there's also what divine wisdom has to communicate to us about these sufferings. I think of the wonderful Jewish scholar from whom I have learned so much, Gerhard von Rad. In his book, Wisdom in Israel, he reflects on this, and he does a terrific job. It's one of those books that I hope you'll be interested in consulting as the result of this course. In the course of these lectures on biblical wisdom, we will be looking at all these various questions, but beginning with this problem of suffering as our opening gambit, because it is so engaging, the case of the incomprehensible suffering of the character of Job. The scene that we are to see in the beginning of Job and his troubles is Job seated on the ground with ashes thrust upon his head, his garments torn. But interestingly, he's not there alone. We see him in the company of three of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and they are sitting there with him grieving. In fact, they're practicing a wonderful custom within Judaism called sitting Shiva. The custom is that one sits with someone who is suffering, sometimes conversing, sometimes simply being compassionate toward a person who is suffering, and sitting there in silence, waiting for the person who is suffering to begin to speak. As they're sitting there, we are also given, Job is not, but we are also given a sense of a perspective from on high, namely that while his friends think of Job as suffering from some kind of suffering because of the way in which he's being punished, Job is insisting that he is not being punished. And in fact, we are given a sense from the earlier parts of Job that he is not someone who is in fact suffering because of sin, but rather it's a kind of divine test. He's described in those opening chapters as wholehearted and upright, a man who feared God and who shunned evil. And we're seeing in part of those opening chapters the council of heaven, in which a figure, a very curious figure, by the name of Satan, is there in conversation with the other angels before God. In our later tradition, Satan is the name for a true demon or devil, and there's a good reason for that. Here at this point, in the course of biblical revelation, the name Satan doesn't yet have all of those connotations. He's one of the heavenly council, and his name simply means the accuser. True to his name, Satan makes an accusation, and the accusation is this. He says to God, Job is only being reverential. Job is only being faithful and praising you because of his prosperity. And so what Satan the accuser does is to suggest a kind of a devilish trial. Maybe that's why we start thinking of him as a devil, and why in subsequent tradition that's the name for the chief devil like Lucifer. The test is this. If Job were to be deprived of what he most loved, would he still show that same devotion to God? Or would he now start cursing God because of what he has had to suffer? God, trusting that Job will be faithful in bad times as well as in good, God allows Job to be tried and to be tested on the condition that his life be spared. There will be severe losses, but the losses that are inflicted upon Job will never touch his life. So in this opening scene where we've got Job being tested, we also see these three friends of his sitting Shiva with him. That goes on for quite some number of chapters. More than half the book is devoted to those conversations. We'll have the chance to consider those conversations in lectures 8 and 9 and 10. For the moment, it's enough to notice simply that these friends all assume that Job must have been guilty, and in fact, guilty of something serious enough to have provoked such enormous suffering. Job, on the other hand, insists that he is innocent, that if he sinned like any man has sinned, he's at least never done anything that was so egregious as to deserve a suffering as horrendous, the loss of his children, the loss of his property, the loss of his servants. He's no more guilty than anybody else. Reluctant to speculate on the possible reasons for his suffering, Job insists instead, from the posture of faith, that even in his darkness, that even in his suffering, God will come to his help. There's a very beautiful passage in which he says, I know that my Redeemer lives. And he insists that he will be proven innocent, if only he can have his day in court. And so his greatest insistence is precisely on getting his chance to have the trial. After a lengthy conversation in which various angles are tried in order to figure out this problem, a new character emerges on the scene, a much younger man, not like Job's friends, perhaps of his same age, a man named Elihu. And Elihu, with all the great confidence of which sometimes the young are capable, Elihu suggests he knows God's mind, and he can show that God is perfectly just. But if God is perfectly just and innocent, then Job must somehow be guilty. Well, hardly has Elihu finished his speech. What do you know? God himself appears, a grand theophany, and God refuses to submit himself to any court proceedings, the ones that Job has been pleading for. Instead, God vindicates Job's innocence. This is a faithful man whom he had known from the beginning would be faithful despite his trials. And God castigates the presumption of Elihu and the misjudgment of Job's trio of friends. In fact, at God's directive, Job starts pleading for his friends so that they will be spared punishment themselves for any presumption that may have had. Then there's the problem of the ending of the book of Job. In the epilogue, there's a scene in which Job gets the restoration of his fortunes. He gets new children. His prosperity is returned. And it's a story that, part of the story that we can very much love because it's the happy ending. But some scholars think that it may have been added by those thinkers who weren't so much following out the internal logic of Job, the tragedy of life and the need to have faith in the midst of tragedy, but perhaps was added by people who shared one of the perspectives of the Bible's other wisdom books, the book of Proverbs. We'll discuss that problem when we get to Lecture 12, so I simply want to whet your appetite for some of the philosophical debate that we need to have. As we ponder this, what it seems to me that the text itself shows is the incredible fidelity of Job, the way in which he is absolutely steadfast in insisting God will show his utter rectitude and he will correct injustice and misfortune. It seems to me that the Bible is pondering this and pondering it deeply by the way in which Job, the book of Job, as well as the character of Job shows it, and the other biblical texts are in conversation with it. What we need to do is to look at the questions here, the general question of suffering, the use to which suffering might be put, because many of the spiritual writers reflecting upon the Bible have seen in this advice for how we ourselves are to conduct our own lives in a time of suffering, and how we're to deal with those who are put in our path, our family members or our friends. We'll consider the relative merits of being silent and listening, trying to elicit perhaps a sense of what people are feeling. And then we'll consider the better and the worse ways in which one should speak. Not everything that one thinks of saying is always the most compassionate thing to say to someone who is suffering. We'll consider a little bit some possible ways to pray in the midst of suffering, the way to endure in patience and perseverance, the way to hope. Let me now turn for a few minutes to what the course as a whole will look like. The anguish of Job speaks so loudly to us, but there are lots of other problems that are addressed in the Bible's sapiential books. We'll find ways to examine these various books from a number of perspectives. We need to look at the texts themselves, the genres in which the writers are using and trying to explore problems of wisdom, their place within the Bible as a whole. We'll look at the questions theologically and philosophically that these books pose, the answers that they give. We'll look at the ways in which we might use some of these answers in our own lives. And we'll also look at the question about human wisdom, about divine revelation, and about human response to divine revelation. There's very interesting questions in those matters. The order that we'll use for the topics in this course is roughly chronological. We don't know with utter accuracy the dates of many of these books. At best, we can put them in a certain historical period. And even then, there's some scholarly dispute about which came first, or perhaps the ways in which the texts were developed. But we'll be using for this course the rough chronological order that scholars have established through the books of Proverbs, Job that we've been discussing, Koheleth, which is also called Ecclesiastes, Sirach, known as Ecclesiasticus in some traditions, the Song of Songs, sometimes called the Canticle of Canticles, the book of Daniel, the Wisdom of Solomon. And then toward the end of the course, we'll save 3 lectures for the Gospels, in which Jesus shows himself connected very deeply with the sages of earlier biblical wisdom. In addition to those books, there's also the Bible's prayer book, the Psalms. There are many different types of psalms, but some of those 150 psalms seem to me to be very clearly belonging to a group of didactic poetry that we call the wisdom psalms. I'll be making use of those psalms as a kind of interlude within this course at various points. After we've considered one or another book, we'll use those psalms to sort of take a moment apart and to think about how to reflect on what we've just studied in the books, perhaps how to pray about it, and to reflect on what the problem is before we go on to the next book. There are various sources, of course, for wisdom. I'd like to mention three in particular. There is the experience that we have and the reflection upon our personal experience, or vicariously the experience that others have that we come to know about, perhaps read about. Secondly, there's a reflection that we have to make on the nature of things. Sometimes the way things are is really explaining to us more about how to deal with it and perhaps God's intent. And finally, there is a source of wisdom that is divine revelation. So whether we're doing this from the point of view of literature or history or philosophy, there is a kind of wisdom, and biblical wisdom is strong in teaching us about this, that comes through prayer and through meditation and through insight from this revealed set of texts. We will then do well to be asking ourselves regularly as we study this, what is it that's coming from human reflection on experience? What is it that's coming from nature? What is it that's coming from God and from the way in which He's trying to elicit a response to us? I think that in making this kind of study, that both those who are believers and non-believers alike will find much of great interest in these materials. There's something that even a believer who has already made use of these texts may find helpful. You know, sometimes we get into patterns and habits, for example, habits of prayer, where we tend regularly to do it the same way. And what I have found in my own experience, for instance, of making retreats and of reading books on this subject, is that it can be really helpful to have people suggest new ways of praying or new ways of reading a text. So I'm hopeful that this study will be useful for those who are believers in perhaps deepening and broadening their ways of praying. My preliminary note at this point is this: if you already have a method that works for you, the best advice that I can give is stick with it. But sometimes people are looking for a new way, and so I hope that what I have to offer will be taken in that spirit. And for those who are not particularly given to prayer or to reflection in that mode, it may be interesting just to know what believers do and what this phenomenon of prayer is about. It will be helpful in understanding others with whom we meet and deal, and perhaps give us suggestions of something analogous in our own life. I think, for instance, of some of the great philosophers who had a habit of meditation that, even though it wasn't particularly directed to God, was still extremely prayerful. Our course will consider these questions then about what the Bible has to offer and what human experience has to do in responding to that. And in the course of our lectures, we will look at these one after the other. In the next lecture, I'll begin by doing this with the oldest of the biblical wisdom literature, namely the book that's called Proverbs. But to set us up for this, perhaps I should speak for just a moment about translations, because when one is using ancient texts like these, we're presumably going to be reading them in English rather than them in the original language. There are many wonderful translations of the Bible that are available. In fact, I would urge that you consider using different translations in the course of your study. As we move through the text, we'll be looking at a number of different English translations, and by that sample, we'll see some of the variety that's possible. If you have a Bible translation that's already available, or one that for reasons of your own that you prefer, that's perfectly fine. It can be helpful both to use that text as well as the one that I'll be using, and I'll identify which one at points in the course of our series. It's useful to have several of these running, if only to see what a given translator has emphasized by choosing this way rather than that way to render a given passage. Which translation is a good one? Well, I think the best thing to consider here is that we do need a translation that's made from the original language. So it's necessary to go back to the original Hebrew, it's necessary to go back to the original Greek, and then to see in the history of the translations what's happened, how to understand some of the problems in the text. So it's crucial that we work on a translation that has a scholarly foundation, one in which the scholars have tried to find an accurate version of these texts. As you know, in the course of copying, mistakes can get made. And the fact is, we do not have the original autograph, that is, the manuscript that the actual author himself wrote. Those who composed the Bible and what texts that they themselves made are now gone. All we have are copies that were made subsequent in history and then copies made after that. And when scribal errors have crept in, modern scholars have had to work hard to restore the original readings and to make good sense of the text. And then the translator has to try to find a way to render this that's easily understandable in our modern idiom. There's even a problem about vocabulary. In the Hebrew text of the Bible, there are only about 5,000 different words that occur. Many of them are used many, many times. But curiously, I found this so fascinating when I first learned it, curiously, 40% of those words, about 2,000 of them, they only occur once. And there are no ancient dictionaries of biblical Hebrew. So what we have to do is to rely upon context for the meaning of those words. In recent years, we've also had archaeological discoveries of other texts in other ancient Near Eastern languages, and if those same words are present in both, we have an even better sense of what those words mean. Because they occur only once, and because many of them are names, we are very, very clear on the meaning of most verses in the Bible. But on the other hand, there are a few problems, and it's only fair to acknowledge those. And scholars have gotten some wonderful methods for trying to resolve the various difficulties. But there is also the problem of finding a translator with appropriate rhetoric for us, that is, appropriate literary skills and theological skills, sensitive to the connotations of different words and phrases, and the ability to turn that phrase into appropriate language in a new version for us in English. For the sake of beginning of our study with the book of Proverbs, I'll be using the translation that's called the New International Version, something produced by the International Bible Society. We'll be able to sample some of the other translations by yet other translators when we turn to other books of the Bible, and I look forward to our study.